Hey guys, Mr. D. Hopefully you guys all had a nice break. We finished with all the genetic stuff, and now we're going to move on to evolution. So evolution is a thing that kind of brings everything that we've done all year together. All right, and we're going to talk about a lot of things that we've learned already, and we're going to apply those to evolution. So one of the things that we learned is there are different atoms, right? And atoms interact and come together to form these different molecules. One of the really important ones that we learned earlier in the year was a phospholipid, right? And if we remember, phospholipids are made up of all these atoms that come together in a specific way, right? So we have this phospho part, and we have the lipid part, right? We have a saturated fat and an unsaturated fat chain, right? And we also learned that phospholipids, right, once they're all formed, they line up together, right, in a way that causes or makes a phospholipid bilayer, which is the membrane we find around all of our cells, right? We also learned about nucleotides, right? And they're also made up of arrangements of atoms, right? And we have the phosphate group, we have the sugar and the nitrogen-containing base, right? And just like the phospholipids, right, once you have the nucleotide, right, those nucleotides line up with other nucleotides and create DNA, right? So how does this have anything to do with evolution? Well, what it has to do with evolution is everything, right, has a phospholipid bilayer, a membrane around all of its cells, and it also, everything has DNA, right? So we're going to tie these two things together, all right? All right, so earlier in the year, like the first thing that we learned is the formation of planets, right? And all the planets came together, right? And every planet has its own composition of atoms, right? So we know that the composition of Earth is made up of mostly hydrogen and oxygen and carbon and nitrogen, right? So all of those things are really the things that we're most made of. If you guys remember Cho, Chan, Chomp, right? All those things that we learned in the beginning of the year. So anyway, what I was saying before is that these molecules come together, and you got to think back to early Earth, right? And think about in the oceans and in the waterways, right? We have these phospholipid bilayers kind of just floating around, and we have these DNA molecules floating around. And at some point, somehow, some way, a phospholipid bilayer engulfed the DNA molecule, right? So now we have a DNA molecule that is engulfed by this phospholipid bilayer, right? So that would be the first signs of life, right? Because we know all life has phospholipid bilayer and DNA, right? But that phospholipid bilayer makes up the nucleus, right? The outside of the nucleus, the nuclear membrane. It also makes up the outside of the cell, right? And we know that there's DNA in every living thing, right? So something like this would be the beginning of life at some point in time. Now we know that these things started to evolve, right? We learned this as well, right? We learned that we had single cell organisms for a long period of time on Earth, right? And then at some point, right, we know that this organism, right, this single cell organism, at some point engulfed through endocytosis, if we remember that, right? But it engulfed a other single cell organism that lived on its own at one time, right? Called a mitochondria, if we remember mitochondria, right? And you guys all know, right, because you all tell me all the time, mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. So we know that mitochondria can convert, right, energy from a sugar or something like that into ATP, right? So at some point, this organism engulfed the mitochondria, but it didn't eat it. It actually just formed a symbiotic relationship with it. So then we had mitochondria in these cells. And because these cells had mitochondria, right, then they were able to become multicellular organisms. So we went from single cell organisms to multicellular organisms from this symbiotic relationship of the mitochondria that was its own organism and other cells that were their own organisms. And once those two things together, we were able to have multicellular organisms, right? So that would be an evolutionary process. All right, guys, what we just learned was, the beginnings of life, right? A phospholipid bilayer engulfs the DNA molecule, which comes together with the mitochondria, allows us to have multicellular life, right? So that's the beginnings of life. Now, what we're talking about here is evolution. How do we get from these single-cell organisms, or even these multicellular organisms, to all the different organisms that we see today, right? Well, we learned in DNA that you can have mutations, right? And mutations can have some effect. They can have no effect. I think the effect that we mainly focused on was cancer. But mutations can have lots of effects, right? We know that the genetic code that makes you different than me is that you have a little bit of a different DNA sequence than I do, right? Well, if that sequence gets changed in a certain way that gives some sort of mutation that gives you an advantage in a certain environment, well, now you have that advantage, right? All right, so what we're looking at here is a petri dish full of bacteria, right? This is all the same bacteria, right? So I have dots and I have some that are X's, right? The X's, we have 5 of them, right, in this petri dish. What we're going to do to that petri dish is we're going to put antibiotics in that petri dish, and we're going to wait some time, right? So we put the antibiotics in this petri dish, and what the antibiotics do is they kill all of the ones that aren't X's, right? The X's have some sort of mutation that makes them immune to this antibiotic. The antibiotic doesn't kill them for whatever reason, whatever that mutation does, right? So we've changed their environment by adding antibiotics. We've killed a lot of the bacteria, but the ones that are X's, that antibiotic doesn't kill them, right? So over time, we wind up with, so they weren't killed by the antibiotics. So now we went from 5 to 10. They've all doubled, right? And we've reduced the number of the bacteria that is susceptible to this antibiotic. And now, over more time, we add more antibiotics, more time, right? We kill off more of those other antibiotics or those other bacteria. But the bacteria that are resistant to that antibiotic, they continue to multiply. So now we've gone from 5 to 10 to 30 now over time. We apply some more antibiotics and we wait some more time. We kill off just about all of the bacteria that doesn't have that mutation, but the bacteria that does have that mutation continues to proliferate, right? So what we wind up with now, we're up to 60 of those bacteria that are resistant, right? So this is evolution, right? We have an environment, right? We've changed that environment by adding the antibiotics. We do have some of these bacteria in there that just happen to have this mutation that allow them to be fine in that environment. So because they're fine in that environment, they're going to continue to reproduce, right? Why wouldn't they? The other ones that can't live in that environment, well, they're dying off, right? So now we've taken this bacteria by adding antibiotics to it, changing its environment, right? And we've basically evolved this species of bacteria to be resistant to antibiotics. So now we have a whole lot of these mutated bacteria that are resistant to the antibiotics, and that's how evolution works. And it works for every organism, right? It works for everything that we see on life has evolved in this way, right? Something that has some sort of advantage in that environment will have more offspring, will live longer, pass its traits on to its offspring. Those offspring will live longer and have more babies, right? Kind of like the whole giraffe thing, right? There happened to be this animal, right, that had a little bit of a longer neck. It could reach more food. It lived longer. It had more babies. It passed on the long neck to its offspring, and they lived longer and had more babies and passed on and just kept passing on that trait. And that's how it works. That's how evolution works. It's a process that we see all the time. It's a process that we see over short periods of time. It's also a process that we see over long periods of time, like millions of years. Any questions? Ask me a Google question.